Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next panel on fiscal policy during the next recession, moderated by Elisabeth Jacobs of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth.
So thank you all again for coming. John? Can you hear me? Good. So I'm Elisabeth Jacobs. I'm the Senior Director for Policy at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. I just want to echo Heather's thanks to all of you for coming. As Larry said when he kicked this off, we've thought a lot about this event. I think it's always hard to imagine what the reality will be a day, a week after an election. And I think many of us woke up to a world that looks a little bit different than the one that we all expected. And so that in some ways I think makes this conversation all the more important. It also makes it all the more difficult to focus squarely on the economics and the economic research, but that's where I want us to start. It doesn't make sense to stay there for the entire conversation, but I do want to kind of start us off by thinking hard about the economics first, because that is where I think we should always be starting. So we're here to talk about the fiscal side of things, and I'm very pleased to be joined by two esteemed experts. Claudia Sahm is a principal economist at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. She's also a member of Equitable Growth Research Advisory Board, who are very important to us, so thank you, Claudia. Sahm specializes in macroeconomics and household finance. She completed her PhD at the University of Michigan, and she was previously on leave to the Council of Economic Advisors and just came back to the Fed this past spring. Jared Bernstein is Senior Fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. From 2009 to 2011, Bernstein was chief economist and economic advisor to Vice President Joe Biden. He was the executive director of the White House Task Force on the Middle Class and a member of President Obama's economic team. So in many ways, I think he'll help us with continuity from that first panel through to the second one. Bernstein's areas of expertise include federal and state economic and fiscal policies, economic inequality and mobility, trends in employment and earnings, international comparisons, and the analysis of financial and housing markets. Basically, if you want to know something about something, ask Jared. He's also the author of a number of books on the economy, most recently one that I read with great interest called The Reconnection Agenda, Reuniting Growth and Prosperity, which came out last spring, a year ago this spring 2015. So we started the panels off with a little bit of a sort of simulation type scenario. We gave these guys some background material just to get them thinking about what different interest rates, different deficit levels, different levels of household debt in the economy might look like, just to kind of get their heads thinking about in what context does a fiscal package make sense? How should we think about the interaction of those various economic indicators in making sense of kind of the whether and how of fiscal policy? So I thought I would start this conversation by kind of throwing it wide open to both of you. Purely on the economic indicators to get a sense of your thinking about when fiscal in the context of stimulus, not just everyday fiscal policy, actually makes sense.
So first, I just need to point out that the comments I make today, these are my own views, and you can't associate those with my colleagues in the Federal Reserve System, which I guess then leads to the question of why I'm sitting up here and why you should listen to me. So I think in thinking about fiscal stimulus, for me, I've learned a lot in these last, in the last 8 years. My very first forecast at the Federal Reserve as the consumption analyst in January of 2008 was when we put in the tax rebate assumptions into the staff forecast. So I'm not usually in the position of thinking about what's the optimal policy. My job is to think about, okay, there's a policy, it's in train, what do we think it'll do for the economy? Because that's important for monetary policymakers to know what's, what they think is coming ahead. So that was my first forecast, was thinking about tax rebates. And there's a lot of like the nuts and bolts and how you think it'll show up in GDP, and there's research with the 2001 tax rebate. So, and I started doing my own research on this. But I think one thing that was humbling, having watched the data roll in real time, and it's a little different perspective than the research that's done after the fact, and we can go back and look on it, is you put all these assumptions together, you go and grab the best research you have, you think of, what the effects are, and I can remember early on making arguments in staff meetings, like, this is what I think, this is the forecast, this is the research, and a senior colleague of mine several decades of experience on me at the Fed, pointed out after one of my presentations, she's like, you know, we will never know what the effects of these tax rebates were. And that was kind of a shock to me as this like junior economist and like straight out like, oh, but if the arithmetic will have to hold and I'll get the numbers. And I think, I mean, that was a good warning. And it really was a wake-up call in real time, because for all of the excellent research that has beautiful identification and finds effects, and you see it, it only takes an op-ed by a well-known but should know better economist pointing out that the saving rate spikes when tax rebates go out for everyone to say it had no impact. It was useless. That was money just down the drain. So I think there's this real challenge. I mean, it's our job to think about what the effects are on the economy, and I think those were real, and that's important. But it's also being able to communicate in real time what these effects are, and that's a challenge, because economists can think in counterfactuals in ways that is not natural to other people. And I find that's what it almost makes it painful to look at all the really excellent research that's there, and yet it's hard to convey that. So I think that was a real humbling experience, watching in real time as it unfolded. And I didn't stop working on the tax rebates. I also, followed the making work pay and the payroll tax credits, and so watched a lot of stimulus work through households. I think there are a lot of lessons, and the last panel mentioned some of these. So I do think tax rebates are an important way to stimulate the economy. One thing to note is when they were put in place, the recession hadn't been called. Like, this was not before, so the scenario we'd been given was, oh, the economy has been contracting for the last 2 quarters and the unemployment rate's falling. I mean, some of these like really quick acting stimulus, like maybe even getting ahead of that makes sense. I mean, by the time you actually see it in like big macro aggregates, the recession is really underway, and it's probably more severe than those initial aggregates are going to tell you. So I do think there's an idea that there are some types of stimulus that work very quickly. The tax rebates take a couple quarters and you see the impacts. And then there's other types of stimulus that take longer, and so you kind of need to like set up a whole series of programs.
Well, those are really great comments. I think whenever you hear a well-placed economist talking about humility and being a little more humble about what we think we know, you should very much listen to that person. I appreciate that. I also think your point about explaining what we're doing is so important. When I think back to all I learned in grad school about what we were doing in the period that Alan and Peter were just talking about, the one course I didn't take, because it doesn't exist, was explaining what we're doing to the American people. And I was one of those people who, as was Alan and Peter, who went out and they called it Pebble Beach, that little part in front of the White House where you explain what's happening. And I recall one day I was about to go out and talk about the jobs report, and we'd lost 700,000 jobs. Now, who in here has ever gone out and stood in front of the White House and told the cameras, we just lost 700,000 jobs, but the package is working? And I remember just sitting there with Christy Romer with this hangdog expression, and David Axelrod put his arm around me and said, get out there, Bernstein, anybody can sell good news. So the idea that people don't do counterfactuals is, of course, true, and you can't really explain to someone that things are better than they would have been otherwise. I think everything that Alan and Peter said about fiscal stimulus in a downturn is completely true, and was expressed, I thought, with great clarity and some humility. So I wouldn't add a whole lot to that. I would say a couple of other things instead. One is that here's a fact that is underappreciated, and it's sort of the core of a lot of my work. We've been at full employment 30% of the time since 1980. So that's a profound observation about the extent of output gaps and slack labor markets outside of recession. Okay, so part of that is recession when you're obviously not at full employment, but we've been the unemployment rate has been above the CBO's full employment rate, which I might argue is, it's a very difficult number to calculate, but if it were, from my perspective, a more realistic natural rate would be lower, and we would have been at full employment even less than 30% of the time. By the way, before 1980, we were at full employment 70% of the time. That's a huge difference. So it is incorrect to think of, maybe stimulative is the wrong word because one might associate stimulus with recession, but growth-oriented, positive fiscal impulse, investment-oriented fiscal policy outside of recession. And if you want to feel, a little better about the election outcome, there's going to be some positive fiscal impulse coming probably, and the economy could use it. The macroeconomy doesn't care who writes the checks, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. That said, there's a smart way and a foolish way to do this kind of investment outside of a downturn, and I think from what I've heard of the Trump infrastructure plan, I don't think it's the right way to go. But I do want to make very clear that fiscal policy in the interest of closing output gaps is highly relevant outside recession. One final point for now on this. Listening to Kim, I was thinking about the following. So we need better early warning indicators. And I keep thinking that big data ought to be helpful here. Hal Varian, who knows a lot about big data, he's the chief economist at Google, or at least he used to be, I don't know if he still is. He often says there's there. He says that if there are indicators that we could be using to get an early sign that things are turning south, that where some of our more lagging indicators, like the unemployment rate, are less effective. Ben Spielberg, I don't know if Ben's here, but he and I wrote a paper about getting ready for the next recession, which I commend to you. Many of the points discussed here today are in the paper. One thing that we looked at were food stamp rolls. You can get the data on food stamp rolls pretty quickly at the state level, and I think that they were kind of an interesting responsive indicator as well.
So I want to go back to your point about fiscal policy outside of recession and its relationship to how we use fiscal stimulus. So it seems like, in some ways, a melding of the economics and the politics, because right now we have the political conversation that is all of a sudden very much about a very large fiscal package, right? And I think everyone would agree that we're not, the recovery is not quite long enough in the tooth to have put us into recessionary territory, right? I will leave it to you to tell me whether I'm right there, but I wonder about the interaction between the two. I mean, on the last panel, there was a little bit of conversation about, or maybe it was actually in Larry's opening remarks, about the not wanting to give away the fiscal tools too quickly, right? But there's a question, to your point, Jared, of if the new consensus is that we should be using fiscal policy every day to stimulate growth, how do we balance doing that and having the appropriate tools ready when we want to do additional fiscal stimulus in recession? That was a long way of asking a simple question, I think.
Okay. So I guess one thing I would point out is I think the technocratic tools for fiscal policy are lacking relative to, say, for monetary policy. There's a simple way to illustrate this, and this was mentioned before, I have hundreds of colleagues at the Federal Reserve that study the economy, help support monetary policy. When I spent last year as a senior economist at CEA, there were 2 PhD staff economists that covered the US macroeconomy. And I did housing policy too. And so it's not that there aren't people outside, but then if you even go into academia, it's not like the balance switches and there's so many more academics that really have a lot of hard and fast tools to help with fiscal policy. So I think it's a challenge, and I think fiscal policy is actually more challenging because you're not just trying to use it to stabilize business cycles. There's also issues of long-run growth, and both are really important, and you need to have good tools. And I think so there's the side of the tools, but when we develop the tools, it isn't helpful that some of the most cutting-edge modern macro DSG models, even the new Keynesian flavor, basically have no role for fiscal policy as an optimal way to stabilize business cycles. Those models tell you do it with monetary policy, and even the macro forecasting, things like FRB-US, they have a fiscal block, but it's really simple. And so these tools that are there, they're not well developed or could be better developed. But I think when we do that, we have to be careful as economists not to develop the tools that we like to use. So before, I totally agree that automatic stabilizers are really important. It's also just because they can move very fast and you want to have those well designed. And we like them too because you don't have to get the political process all going to adjudicate them. But actually, one of the benefits of fiscal policy is it has accountability. It is more transparent. I mean, it's very messy because you're working with all these political groups, but like that's an important part of the process. And so I think for economists, like we have to, when we think about our models, just like you delve into now the plumbing of the financial system, it's important for us to be aware of the plumbing of the political system and make sure that we're giving advice and feedback that kind of fits in the reality of the world such as it is. So I think, I mean, that's kind of at a very like wonky level of tools, but I find that that's something pretty frustrating, that we're still at very basic, broad guidance.
Well, you know, that sounds right to me, but let me recommend what I think is one of the most important papers on fiscal policy that I've read in recent years. I wish I could say I wrote it, but it was written by Jason Furman, who's the current chair of the CEA, and it's very readable for, I think, you know, non-economists and economists alike, and it kind of gets into the weeds of what Kim was just talking about, and at least I came away thinking.
My name's Claudia.
Sorry?
Claudia.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Claudia. God, that's so embarrassing. God, what an idiot. You should have corrected me earlier.
It's okay.
It's your
We'll just
fault.
start calling you Joe.
I'm really sorry. I don't know why. Okay. You're sure?
Yes. Go on.
You're not pranking me. All right. I'm really embarrassed. I love what you've said so far, Claudia. So Jason's paper espouses something called a new view on fiscal policy, and it takes what you've been saying and argues that, in fact, we know more than you just suggested. I actually am closer to, maybe a little bit closer to where you are. If there's anything that it's not a critique of Jason's paper, as I said, it's tremendously important paper. You know, he may, to my eyes and ears, and I'm a creature of this particular swamp, he may be arguing that this new view is more advanced and in people's minds than it really is. I mean, but this is an argument that, especially in an era where interest rates are, at least at the federal funds rate, is bounded by zero and close to the zero lower bound, much more than economists expected it would be, just going back a few years. And when interest rates really across the globe, particularly in advanced economies, and I'm talking about sovereign yields, are all hugging a bound between 1% and zero, fiscal policy not only becomes more important, but very much complementary to monetary policy. And so the new view argues that fiscal and monetary policy, rather than what the models are representing, as you just suggested, that the reality is that they're a 1-2 punch. I wrote about this in the Reconnection Agenda, Chapter 4. It's free on the web if anybody wants to look at it, arguing precisely that in our current economic era, we must view monetary and fiscal as a 1-2 punch, and not as substitutes. The Ricardian view that fiscal policy is ineffective because it simply signals that later we're going to have to pay for it, or that it crowds out private investment. If anything, Jason argues for some crowding in. The argument that we don't have enough fiscal space. In fact, if you look at some of Larry and Brad DeLong and Jason's arguments, we have much more fiscal space than we think, in part because of the interest rate dynamics. The new view is that is much more in keeping with what I said in my first set of comments about the importance of fiscal policy, not just as stimulus, but as a target against output gaps. The one thing I might slightly disagree with is this notion of somehow fiscal policy offers more accountability. And here, I'm echoing Peter and Alan to some extent, and again, reflecting my times out there on Pebble Beach in front of the White House, where people just didn't believe that anything we were doing was having much of an effect. So I was encouraged to write a series, which you can find to this day. It was mostly ran on the Huffington Post, and it was called The Recovery Act in Action. And the idea was that we were going out there, we were talking about how the economy was doing better than you thought, and the counterfactuals, and nobody believed us. So my assignment was to go out there and write about the actual impact. So I remember talking to a guy in Boston. He had a Windows factory. He got a check. He hired some people, and that didn't work either. So I still think we don't know how to get the public on our side on these issues. I think it's a much deeper problem. It's actually something we ought to talk more about, and groups like the Center for Equitable Growth and my own ought to think a lot more about it.
So if I could just follow up, just to clarify actually what I had said. So in saying that I think the technocratic tools are lacking, I didn't in any way mean to say that the technocrats, there is a lot that we've learned. So I mean, the things that Jason Furman has written about, really in preparing for this, the amount of research that I was able to look at and think about, there really has been a rebirth of economists looking at how fiscal policy works. So I'm not saying that no one's paying attention, we believe these models, that it doesn't matter. I'm just saying that in terms of having it codified, in terms of being able to answer, there's a recession with X, Y, and Z parameter, what should we do? And to have some guidance that's regularized and doesn't depend on having some really smart economist who kind of understands all these things that maybe the discipline hasn't entirely taken on. And I think you can see the failure of our tools in the last recession and recovery. I was listening to a panel Olivia Blanchard gave at the Boston Fed a few weeks ago, and when he was talking about, there was this big fiscal stimulus, and it wasn't just in the US, it was across the globe, and in talking about it, he mentioned the reason that he felt like that actually happened was because of fear. So the idea that we have policy makers that are motivated by the world is falling apart and we have to do something, that's a really bad setup. And in particular, and we see the after effects of that in that when the stimulus expired, it didn't just run out, there were deficit reductions and austerity programs that followed right after it. Which again is saying that you don't have good tools to help you know when to put the stimulus on, when to take it off, when's the time to balance the budget. And so I think that's where if you don't have good tools that can be widely used, you end up with a void where simple thresholds like 60 to 90% of GDP ratios, that becomes something that a policymaker grabs onto because they need something. So that's what I meant by tools not being where they need to be.
No, that's exactly right, and especially about the austerity fear and the kinds of misguided parameters that you just mentioned on the fiscal space. But let me just quickly tick through 4 tools that I think we know we need. And I really believe that this may scratch the itch you're raising here. One is to, and you've heard these, so I'm going to be quick, make the EB program, the Emergency Benefit Program under UI, more responsive with better triggers, and that's just not an abstraction. We actually, in the paper with Spielberg, we articulate what we think those triggers ought to look like. We should also add, really amp up the work sharing piece of unemployment insurance in that regard, and that's this idea where instead of laying people off, the hours of a workforce are reduced and partially compensated with UI. So EB with better triggers and work sharing. Temporarily higher SNAP benefits worked really well. My personal favorite, and I think when Gabriel was talking about these elasticities, I think some of them were tricked out of this observation, state fiscal relief. State fiscal relief, I can tell you, worked extremely well, and I don't see why it wouldn't work well based on some of the principles that Alan and Peter were talking about. It needs to be non-discretionary, so that should be automatic. And then finally, and this is to me just the punchline, is that we need, this is to me maybe the best idea I can think of in this space, which is especially in today's world, is that we need a subsidized jobs program that ramps up during recession. But frankly, I would have a dedicated fund for such a program, and it would be ongoing even in downturns for parts of the economy, geographical parts that we all know about, where job growth is insufficient even at low unemployment. I would argue that that's a great set of tools.
So you've mentioned a couple things that bring me back to a lot of what motivated this event in the first place, which is thinking about how high levels of inequality may or may not impact the efficacy of many of the standard tools in the toolkit. And even just going through the four that you mentioned, I can see reasons to think that, for example, automatic stabilizers built around UI are going to mean something very different in an economy where fewer people have access to the unemployment insurance system than before, and a very different distribution than the kind of national distribution of income, right? So that's just one example. There are a bunch of others, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts, and I know, Claudia, this is something that you've written about, as have you, Jared, so I'll let you two kind of take a cut at it.
So I do think here this is where it probably is important to some extent to separate the fiscal policy that you go after in a recession to try and mitigate, to shorten, to stop. Like, I really do believe that these recessions, they have persistent effects. Like, you shouldn't let them drag on. You don't want to be below potential for a long time. So I think, so in a recession, you have a certain set of concerns that may be different than what you have just growth overall. And so, and then this comes from having studied things like the tax rebates and the tax cuts. And I know it's often conventional wisdom that you want to target these to low-income households, low-wealth households. I think and I do think there are a lot of programs like the food stamps and unextended benefit, like that's totally the right thing to do. The thing I worry is that in a recession, actually what makes it a recession is that it's broad-based weakness. And so you see people up and down the income distribution, the wealth, being hit very hard in a recession. And so you could do policy that tries to go and help the people who are most impacted. And that's going to be the younger, the less income, less wealth. But you could also think about, well, who is it this particular recession is really hitting hard? I mean, some of this recession hit hard in the middle and upper part of the wealth distribution because it was through the housing market. A recession of that magnitude, it's not just about low-income people that can't spend. I mean, this is pullback. You have higher income people as well. And I think the thing is in a recession, what you want to do is get the recession over and people back to work as quickly as possible. So there is some argument for these kind of big gun, like lots of different, helping lots of different households, because it's also, and this comes out of the research as well, that like there's a lot of like state dependence, or the conditions matter a lot. So who really benefited or who really responded to the 2008 tax stimulus was actually a little bit different than what you saw in 2001, and the details matter. And it would be very hard for us to think that we could actually like zero in on who are exactly the people who don't have liquidity right now. They know who they are. Get the money out to them, whether it's through stimulus or some of the borrowing facilities, so let them handle it. So I do worry about us trying to get too targeted, because a recession really is a big event. But that doesn't mean that you like lose sight of the broader goal of trying to minimize inequality, and I'm just not sure that that's, in a recession, that's the time.
Well, so in part what Claudia's saying is a response to the fact that, or no, it's not a response, it's just that I didn't have any sort of, on my list, rebate or tax cuts, and I take that point. I guess I think it's hard, and Peter and Alan said this, it's a little bit hard to get the tax cuts to the right people given the politics, and but I take your point. I guess the one thing I would point out is that there is so much fungibility in some of these programs. So state fiscal relief. State fiscal relief is actually this complicated thing called FMAP, which is the federal Medicaid matching thing. So if your state contributes 50%, which would be on the high end, to your Medicaid obligations, in a recession, we ratchet up that formula, so maybe it contributes 10 or 15 or 20%. And so, but what we saw when I traveled around with Vice President Biden, literally I remember one case where this mayor was standing on a platform and he had a bunch of pink slips in one hand and a fiscal relief check in the other hand, and he ripped up the pink slips. And those are middle class jobs. Those were teachers. So there is a fungibility point there.
I'm going to open it up to Q&A right there in the middle. Please tell us who you are and tell us if you have one, your affiliation, and please, when you ask your question.
I'm Great Recession. I and I've listened to this panel about how, I guess, maybe it wasn't established under the quite the situation we're facing now. And so we started with under what indicators should be used to then start fiscal stimulus. I guess my question now, facing with the administration of a unified Republican government that is uniformly opposed to much fiscal stimulus, how do you propose that we make a better case for this fiscal stimulus? And when it doesn't happen, what do you see as the long-term consequences? Do we just sit around and wait for monetary policy to work its magic, or do we see other consequences?
So there's an old definition of a Keynesian as a Republican in a recession. And I've seen that happen a lot. In fact, if you recall, the first rebate check of the Great Recession was signed by George W. Bush. So, and you also, President-elect Trump is probably about to sign a pretty significant, what you'd have to call under the rubric of this conference, some sort of a fiscal plan. I worry, as I said in my comments, that it will be largely badly drawn, particularly on a big regressive tax cut. But it is incorrect to conclude that somehow Republicans don't like to spend money when they're in power or worry about deficits when they're in power, because they do like to spend money and they don't worry about deficits. They just like to do it under the rubric of tax cuts as opposed to spending, and the tax cuts tend to be, quite regressive. I think where your comments are germane and relevant is that a lot of what I've heard today from the stage, is stuff, and I think Heather's been very clear about this, talking about our longer-term research agenda, is stuff that's going to have a pretty long incubation period given the current politics, or at least the politics we're probably looking at. And yes, I worry a great deal about the next recession, in part because I think the Fed, as Larry and others have suggested, won't have time to adequately reload, but also because I don't think the people in charge will be listening to the sage advice that we're giving today.
I'm going to take 2 questions if there are questions, because I've gotten my 5-minute warning, but I want to get a couple questions on board. So one right up front and all the way back in black.
So you heard in the last panel that the mantra...
Can you speak up? Because I don't think the microphone, or at least we're not hearing it.
Is that clearer?
Yeah, there you go.
So the mantra, as recorded in the last panel, was timely, temporary, and targeted. But the ultimate timely and temporary and targeted intervention is an automatic stabilizer. So if there is consensus around those 3 T's, can it be built into consensus to get and build automatic stabilizers? And if not, why not?
And can we take the other one as well, and we'll just bundle them and let these folks kind of give as much of an answer as they can.
Hi, my name is Berkeisha Sams, and I work with Pew's Fiscal Federalism Initiative. And my question is, I think with the sense of the election, I got a feeling that there was a lot of anti-government backlash, but I think we're kind of entering a new phase where it's an anti-fact backlash. And so how do you think we combat that, especially as folks who work at think tanks and who are really geared in, really meticulous research? So I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Do you want to take that one first?
I'll take the fact one, but why don't you go first on the automatic?
Okay, so I think the point about targeting, and I do, from the panels you've heard so far, we've talked a lot about automatic stabilizers and how those can be improved. So I think those principles do come through. The only thing I would mention on targeting, and again, these are really loose principles, right, is that every recession has its own cause. Right? I mean, the dynamics of recessions can often be shared. You see very sharp drops in output. You have sentiment collapse. I mean, there are things that make a recession different from just growth has slowed a little bit the last couple quarters. So, but I do think there's an aspect of what was the trigger of the recession, or what were the conditions prior to the recession. So it was mentioned before that, we really we need to understand the financial system better. This was a financial crisis that had implications. that's probably not the next recession we see. The next recession could be something more garden variety, like things we've seen, or it could be something we've never seen, like a recession that's not led by the US economy and that hits the US in a way that's different. And so I think you want to have the automatic stabilizers be your first line of defense, and maybe a continuing line of defense, such as through the state governments. I mean, that can come with lag, so it's not about all at once. But you also, I think, have to have a policy framework where you can actually look at what's happening, and there is still a role for some discretionary policy that's going to be specific to that event. So that's harder, but I think that actually fits with the targeting. So
let me take a quick stab at both questions. This is not a critique at all of what Peter said, because Ben and I wrote exactly the same thing in our piece. But this idea that if you listen to Peter and you listen to the way Ben and I tee it up, we say pretty much what I think was on your mind, which is we really need to improve the depth, the targeting, and the effectiveness of our automatic stabilizers. And the reason we need to do that is because we really can't trust Congress to get it together and do discretionary policy in a timely manner. Okay, that's the motivation for what Peter said, I believe, and the motivation for what I said and what Ben and I wrote. And if you listen to Claudia just now, she makes the good point that, in fact, the discretionary piece is really important because you can maybe shape it given the nature of the recession. But this Congress is going to be, now first let me quickly give a disclaimer. No one should listen to anybody's political prediction, especially mine, anymore, probably for about 10 years. But from what I can see, this Congress, I'm really quite confident that this Congress is going to be extremely hostile to almost everything we're talking about, particularly saying to them, we can't trust you to do discretionary stuff in a timely manner, so could you please implement more automatic stuff? So I think we're kind of whistling past the reality in that regard. We know what we should be doing, in my view, but it's going to be an extremely heavy lift based on the hostility from the Republican-dominated Congress on these issues. You ask just such an important question about facts, and Heather's shop and our shop and everybody, the Federal Reserve with hundreds of PhDs, we're all in the fact business, and yet facts are on the run. Facts didn't determine, as far as I can see, much of anything in the last election. I totally agree with Alan Kruger's assessment of the current economy. And the day before the election, I was commissioned to write an op-ed for a newspaper on, what the hell? I mean, it seems like the economy's doing really pretty well. How is this candidate getting away, Trump, by saying, it's a disaster? Now, there are, of course, pockets of the U.S. economy, and they're not trivial. I don't mean they're just little corners, where no question growth hasn't reached, and that's the inequality problem that we're all I've been thinking and writing about for 30 years, so not for a second do I diminish the importance of that, but of course that's, now I'm talking facts again. So the problem is a very deep one, and I don't have a good answer to your question. All I know is that we're going to keep doing what we've been doing for those of us in the facts business, and it's not enough. It's sort of like what I was saying earlier. Why aren't the think tanks spending a lot more time on the question you just asked? Part of it is because we're all sort of stuck in this 501c3 world, and that's another issue. There are people who sort of argue that once we stop talking about facts, we're outside of our purview. And I just think that unless we tackle your question, we can have all kinds of nice conferences about what we should do, and it will be for naught.
Well, on that note, I want to thank both of our panelists and all of you for being here and engaging on a key question. Thank you both.
Yep. Thank you.